Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery, where church bells ring without touch, the dead answer their own summons, and fear itself becomes a killer. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. It was on one of those cold and mist-laden mornings in November that I found my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, in a state of uncharacteristic animation. The fire in our sitting room at Baker Street was burning brightly, though the air beyond the window lay thick and colourless, diffusing the faint chime of distant church bells. Holmes stood before the hearth, his dressing gown loosely tied, and a half-consumed cigarette drooping from his fingers, while his eyes were fixed upon a small object upon the mantelpiece, a bronze bell of curious design. "I dare say, Watson," he said, without turning his gaze, "you have never seen a church bell that could ring without being touched." "Without being touched," I repeated, glancing from the bell to him in surprise. "Surely you are not speaking of ghosts, Holmes?" "Ghosts, my dear fellow, exist chiefly in the minds of those who prefer mystery to reason," he replied with a thin smile. "And yet this little bell has been heard to sound at the precise moment of death more than once." I had barely seated myself when Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon her tray. Holmes took it, read it, and his brows lifted slightly. "Ah, Watson, our visitor is a man of the cloth," he said. "The Reverend Charles Penfold of Street Bartholomew's in Highgate. Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." Moments later, a tall, solemn gentleman in clerical attire entered, his face lined by anxiety and sleeplessness. Holmes motioned him to the armchair opposite. "You are troubled, Reverend," said Holmes quietly, "and you bring a matter that has less to do with theology than with death." The clergyman started. "Then you already know?" "I know," said Holmes, "that your hand trembles when you touch that card. On its edge is smudged, where your thumb rested, suggesting you wrote it in haste. You come from Highgate, and the faint traces of limestone on your boots suggest you walked recently through the churchyard. A recent burial, perhaps, in an event that has shaken your faith in the order of things?" The Reverend's lips quivered. Yes, Mr. Holmes. It concerns the bells of Street Bartholomew's. 3 nights ago, they rang by themselves each time just before a death occurred." Holmes leaned forward. "By themselves? There was no one in the belfry? I swear it. I was in my study preparing Sunday's sermon when I heard the first toll. I sent our sexton, old Mr. Hall, to investigate. He returned, pale as a ghost. The ropes hung motionless. Yet only an hour later, we learned that Miss Eleanor Vance, who lives by the North Gate, had died suddenly in her sleep." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And the second time?" "The following night," said the clergyman, "the bells rang again, 5 clear notes. The same unearthly rhythm. This time, it was the verger, Samuel Pike, who fell dead of what the doctor called heart failure. Last night it happened once more, and this morning I found Hall himself, our sexton, lifeless beside the bell ropes. The villagers believe the church is cursed." For a long moment Holmes was silent, his steepled fingers pressed beneath his chin. Then he rose abruptly, pacing the rug. 3 deaths in 3 nights, each heralded by the tolling of bells that no living hand touched, he murmured. "A fine piece of theatre, if one wished to hide a hand in the matter. Tell me, Reverend, was there any alteration recently made to the belfry or tower?" "Only some minor repairs to the supports and pulleys," Penfold replied. "A stonemason named Cribbens supervised the work." "Cribbens," Holmes repeated. "A name that deserves attention. And who were these victims to one another?" Reverend hesitated. "They all served the church in one way or another. Miss Vance kept the accounts. Pike was our verger. Hall tended the grounds. They were close, though there was some unpleasantness over a donation made last spring, a bequest of £50 from a parishioner's will." "Money," said Holmes softly. "Always money, or the passions it provokes." Watson, who until now had been listening intently, asked, "But how do you account for the bells, Holmes? Surely you don't suppose—" that they rang of their own accord? Certainly not. Mechanics or mischief? Watson, never miracles. Reverend, you say each ringing preceded the death by roughly an hour? Precisely. Holmes nodded. Then we have a clockwork of sorts, or a clever imitation of one. Watson, we go to Highgate. Before the Reverend could express his gratitude, Holmes had already thrown aside his dressing gown, seized his coat, and was securing his hat with a determined air. As our cab rattled through the fog-bound streets, Holmes's gaze was distant. You see, Watson, he said at last, we are dealing with an intellect, not a phantom. The trick of the tolling bells is but the surface. Beneath it lies motive, perhaps vengeance, perhaps avarice, but certainly design. Highgate appeared more spectral than ever under the grey November sky. The church of St. Bartholomew's loomed upon the hill, its tower half obscured by drifting mist. The faint clang of metal echoed from within as we approached. Inside, Holmes inspected the ropes, pulleys, and wheels of the ancient belfry, every surface dusted with lime and pigeon feathers. He examined the floor with a magnifying glass, pausing once to lift a small brass fragment. Watson, he said quietly, do you perceive these indentations? I looked closely. They seem like footprints, but too narrow, almost like the heel of a boot scraping sideways. Precisely, said Holmes. And observe the soot on the wall here, a faint arc, as though made by an object swung in haste. He pocketed the brass fragment. We shall keep this, Watson. I believe we have already heard the first chime of an ingenious mechanism and perhaps the first whisper of murder. Holmes descended the narrow belfry staircase with the same swift precision with which he had ascended it, his long fingers brushing against the cold stone walls as if reading some secret inscription. Outside, the fog had thickened. Even the gravestones below seemed to waver like ghosts adrift in a grey sea. I followed him into the nave, where Reverend Penfold waited, his hands clasped tightly before him. Holmes's eyes, sharp and distant, were already fixed upon the church floor. 3 deaths, he murmured, his voice echoing faintly through the empty aisles, each announced by a bell that moves without touch. A mechanism, Reverend, but one of extraordinary delicacy. Tell me, has anyone had access to the tower apart from yourself, the sexton, and the verger? Penfold hesitated. Only Mr. Cribbins, the stonemason. He finished his work 2 weeks ago. But surely, Mr. Holmes, you cannot suspect him of such devilry. Holmes turned, one eyebrow raised. I suspect no man until he proves himself unworthy of the benefit of doubt. Still, when a man tampers with the heart of a church tower, it is rarely for architectural poetry. He bent to inspect the base of a pillar, running his hand lightly along the mortar. Fresh, he observed. The repair work was indeed recent. Watson, note the discoloration here. See how it darkens toward the corner. Lime dust mixed with fine metallic residue. Someone has been filing metal in this church, and not for ornament. As if on cue, a firm step echoed from the entrance, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard emerged from the mist with his familiar air of professional skepticism. Ah, Holmes. Reverend Penfold telegraphed the yard early this morning. I thought I'd see what devil's work was troubling the parish. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Always a pleasure, Lestrade. Tell me, how fares your faith in logic today? I'll believe whatever brings this business to an end, the inspector replied dryly. 3 dead in as many days, and the townsfolk ready to burn the belfry down. If it's machinery you suspect, I've found nothing but ropes and bells. Then you were looking for the wrong kind of machinery, said Holmes. The most dangerous contraptions are often invisible until one listens for their rhythm. We followed him as he strode toward the vestry, the Reverend hurrying behind. Holmes paused at a small door leading into a narrow passage lined with old hymnals and candle stubs. There, at the foot of the stairs, he crouched. Watson, observe this footprint, he said. The same narrow heel as before, but here see the faint trace of copper dust. Lestrade, if you please, take note. This copper will likely match a fragment I retrieved from the tower. Our murderer, or rather, our engineer, has been busy. Lestrade frowned. An engineer, you say? And what sort of engineer kills 3 people with bells? The sort who wishes death to appear divine, Holmes replied. A murderer who understands that superstition is a finer disguise than any mask. Reverend, I would like to speak to your stonemason, this Mr. Cribbins. Where might we find him? At the quarry, I believe, said Penfold, his voice low. He lives on the outskirts of Highgate, near the lime pits. Holmes nodded. Excellent. Watson, you and I will pay him a visit this afternoon. Lestrade, I would ask you to remain here and see that no one tampers with the tower. I have a feeling our phantom bell ringer is not yet finished. Outside, the fog pressed close as we made our way toward the lime pits. Holmes was silent for much of the walk, his eyes scanning the ground with restless intent. At length, he spoke. There is a pattern here, Watson, as precise as a watchmaker's mechanism. 3 victims linked by service to the church, each death foretold by the same sequence of tolls. You see the symmetry? Whoever designed this wanted the illusion of judgment, 3 tolls for 3 souls, as if the bells themselves condemned them. Then you believe this was murder by design, not coincidence? I asked. Coincidence, he said sharply, is the refuge of the lazy mind. I believe that someone wished these people dead and built the perfect theater for their passing. When we reached the quarry, the smell of damp lime filled the air. A squat cottage stood nearby, its windows dim with soot. Holmes knocked twice before the door opened to reveal a thick-set man with coarse hands and a wary eye. Mr. Cribbins, I presume, Holmes said pleasantly. We come on behalf of Street Bartholomew's. You carried out the recent repairs to its tower. The man nodded slowly. Aye, that I did. Fine old stonework, though dangerous in the upper joints. Why? Because, said Holmes, 3 people are dead, and your work may have more to do with it than mortar and stone. Tell me, when you repaired the pulleys, did you alter the bell frame? Cribbins' jaw tightened. I did what was asked, nothing more. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Indeed, yet I fancy you left something behind, something small, metallic, and far from innocent. The stonemason's face paled. I don't know what you mean. But Holmes smiled faintly. No? Then perhaps you will not object if we inspect your tool shed. For the first time, I saw fear flicker behind the man's eyes. He hesitated, then stepped aside. Holmes entered without waiting for permission. On the workbench lay a coil of thin wire, a half-built gear, and a small brass hammer. Holmes touched the wire with a fingertip and whispered, A bell that rings without touch here lies its voice. He straightened, his expression grim. Watson, I believe we are hearing the echo of murder long before the final bell has tolled. Holmes examined the wire with the delicacy of a jeweler, letting the faint afternoon light glint along its surface. It was copper, tightly coiled, and ended in a series of fine hooks, ingenious, almost invisible against the backdrop of the workbench. I could see the glimmer of fascination in Holmes's eyes as he laid it flat, his finger tracing its length to a small brass cog that seemed freshly filed. A mechanism of precision, he murmured, and one intended not for craft but concealment. Tell me, Cribbins, where did you intend this to go? The stonemason wiped his hands on his apron, his rough voice uneven. I told you, sir, I just repaired what was broken. That wire's from an old clock, that's all. Found it in the tower when I cleared the joints. Indeed, Holmes said softly, his tone carrying the weight of disbelief. And yet you've kept it here, neatly coiled, alongside a hammer of your own making. You have the hand of an artisan, Cribbins, but your conscience betrays the tremor of guilt. Perhaps you'd prefer to explain how your clockwork bell can toll without rope or ringer? Cribbins' eyes darted between us, and for a fleeting instant his defiance faltered. "You think I killed them," he muttered. "You think I'd curse my own church?" Holmes regarded him coolly. "I think, Mr. Cribbins, that you were paid for your skill, and perhaps more handsomely than a mason's wage. You know the belfry's secrets better than any man alive, and you understand leverage, pulleys, and sound. I ask only who paid you, and for what purpose?" There was a long silence, broken only by the creak of the wind against the shed. Then Cribbins said hoarsely, "You're barking up the wrong tree, Mr. Holmes. I fixed the tower. I did nothing more. If those bells ring, it's not by my doing." Holmes gave a faint nod, though his eyes never left the man's. "Then we shall see whether the dead will defend you." He turned sharply to me. "Watson, note this gear, this wire, and that hammer. They form part of a mechanical assembly. Lestrade will find it most enlightening." Without another word, Holmes pocketed the small cog and strode out into the fading light. I followed, pausing once to glance back at Cribbins. The man had sunk onto a stool, his shoulders slumped, staring at the floor as though the earth itself condemned him. When we were clear of the cottage, Holmes spoke in a low tone. "Fear, Watson. Not guilt. That was the tremor I saw in him. Our man is complicit, yes, but not the architect. Someone else constructed this web, and Cribbins is merely one thread caught within it." "You believe he's covering for someone?" I asked. "Unquestionably," Holmes replied. "The precision of that mechanism is not born of a stonemason's hand. It bears the design of a watchmaker or an engineer accustomed to working with timing devices. Remember the rhythm the Reverend described? 5 notes. Always the same. Always measured. That is no accident, Watson, it is code." We had scarcely reached the road when the sound of hurried footsteps came from behind. Reverend Penfold was approaching, his breath clouding in the chill air. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped. "Thank heavens I found you. There's been another ringing the bells just now, again, but this time there was no death. At least, not yet." Holmes's eyes flashed. "No death, you say? Then the cycle has broken, or the killer has miscalculated. How long ago did it happen?" "Less than half an hour," the clergyman said, trembling. "I came at once. The bells tolled 5 times, same as before, but when we searched, there was no sign of anyone hurt or dead." Holmes drew his watch, checking the time. 15 minutes before sunset, he muttered. "The bells toll the warning before the death follows. If the killer intended another victim, we may yet be in time." He hailed a passing hansom with abrupt urgency, ushering us both inside. As the horse clattered down the Highgate Road toward the church, Holmes's face was lit by that strange intensity that always accompanied his most dangerous deductions. "You see, Watson, the device in the tower must be controlled remotely or preset to strike at certain intervals. But this premature ringing suggests human interference. Someone tampered with the mechanism, either to warn us or to force the murderer's hand." "And the next victim?" I asked, the question heavy in the air. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the misty outline of the church tower ahead. "The next victim, Watson, is the one who fears the bells most. And I dare say we shall find them alive or dead before the hour strikes again." We arrived at Street Bartholomew's as the final tint of daylight drained from the sky. Holmes leapt from the cab and entered the churchyard at once, his steps quick and soundless over the frosted grass. Inside, Lestrade was already waiting, his face pale beneath the lantern light. "They've rung again, Holmes," he said grimly. 5 strokes, no hands on the ropes. "The villagers are half mad with fear. Reverend Penfold swears no one went near the tower." Holmes's gaze darted upward to the shadowed belfry. "Then the question, my dear Lestrade, is not who rang the bells, but who stopped them before they tolled the death they were meant to announce." He moved forward, his voice a whisper that seemed to vibrate with the same cold energy as the iron bells above. Someone is playing with time itself, Watson, and before the night is out, the bells will ring again. The church stood in a silence more dreadful than any sound, the air heavy with the memory of the bells that had rung only moments before. Holmes moved like a shadow through the nave, his lantern casting long, restless shapes across the stone walls. The faint smell of oil and dust clung to the air, mingling with the cold breath of the evening. Lestrade followed close behind, his hand nervously resting on the butt of his revolver, while Reverend Penfold trailed a few paces back, his face ashen with fear and confusion. Holmes stopped abruptly near the altar, his head tilted slightly as though listening for something beyond the range of mortal ears. "Watson," he said softly, "what do you make of that sound?" I strained to listen, but heard only the faint creak of wood settling in the rafters. "It's nothing, Holmes," the building sighing against the cold. "Exactly," he replied, his tone suddenly sharp. "A building of this age does not sigh in rhythm." Listen again, 3 short creaks, a pause, then 2, like the pattern of the bells themselves. He raised his lantern, and we followed his gaze to a narrow wooden panel behind the altar. With quick precision, Holmes pressed against the edges until it gave way, revealing a dark recess filled with dust and cobwebs. Inside, a thin copper wire ran upward, vanishing into the stone ceiling. Holmes touched it gently, then smiled grimly. "There, Watson. Our phantom's string," Lestrade swore under his breath. "Good Lord, it's been under our noses the whole time." "Not quite," said Holmes. "This wire connects to the mechanism in the belfry, but it was meant to be invisible, concealed behind these panels, and timed to ring on command. The question is, commanded by whom?" Before I could respond, a low moan echoed from the far side of the church. The sound was faint, almost human. We turned sharply, our lanterns slicing through the gloom, and there, half hidden behind a pew, lay a figure sprawled upon the floor. Reverend Penfold gasped and rushed forward. "It's Mrs. Hall, the sexton's widow." Holmes knelt beside her, checking her pulse. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "The bells," she whispered hoarsely. They told me he'd come for me next." "Who, madam?" Holmes asked gently. "Who is he?" She shook her head weakly, tears streaking her cheeks. "I don't know. I only heard his voice. After my husband died, I heard it every night, the bells calling my name." Her voice broke into sobs. Holmes placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "No one is calling you from beyond, Mrs. Hall, but someone wishes you to believe so. Tell me, did your husband have enemies? Or debts?" "Only the church," she said bitterly. "He begged the Reverend for more pay after the repairs, but they quarreled. Then he said something strange, that he'd found a way to make the bells sing without hands. I thought he was mad." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Fascinating. That, Watson, is the missing piece. Hall must have discovered the mechanism himself, or perhaps helped install it. When he realized what it could do, he became dangerous to someone's plan. His death silenced him before he could speak." Lestrade frowned. "Then, you think this whole business, the tolling, the deaths, it's all to cover up the use of this machine?" Holmes rose to his full height, his expression grave. "Not merely to cover it, Lestrade, but to weaponize it. Imagine bells that predict death, ringing by unseen means. Fear becomes a tool, and fear, my dear Inspector, is the sharpest blade a killer can wield." A sudden clang echoed from above one bell, struck hard and alone. Mrs. Hall shrieked. Holmes darted toward the staircase, leading to the tower, his coat swirling like a dark wing. "Watson! With me!" The climb was narrow and treacherous, the wooden steps creaking beneath our feet. The ringing grew louder, rhythmic and unnatural. When we reached the top, Holmes thrust open the trapdoor, revealing the massive bells swaying gently in the gloom. Beneath them, a tangle of wires gleamed in the lamplight, connected to a small, intricate device bolted to the wall. Holmes examined it swiftly, his fingers tracing the mechanism. A clockwork trigger, set to ring the bells by electric impulse. Cribben's handiwork, without doubt, but someone more clever, designed the timing. He looked down, eyes narrowing. "Watson, fetch Lestrade. The murderer's work is still incomplete." As I turned to descend, Holmes's voice followed me through the echoing stairwell. "The bells have spoken too soon once already. Their next chime will not foretell a death, it will deliver one." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, mingling with the low metallic hum from above. Somewhere below, I heard Mrs. Hall's muffled sobs and Reverend Penfold's prayers, but over it all, the faint ticking of the clockwork persisted steady, merciless, counting down toward something unseen. And as I reached the nave once more, the bells began to tremble, ready to toll again, not for the dead this time, but for the living who stood too close to the truth. The ticking from the mechanism in the tower was growing louder, faster, like the pulse of some mechanical heart nearing exhaustion. Holmes bent over the infernal contraption, his sharp eyes drinking in every gear and coil with feverish attention. His fingers hovered an inch above the clockwork, as if the faintest touch might awaken it. "Watson," he said softly, "observe the timing spring. Do you see that tension wound beyond the limit? It's been tampered with. The next strike will not toll a bell, it will detonate." I felt a chill race down my spine. "Detonate? Holmes, surely you don't mean—" "A charge," he interrupted briskly, his tone clipped. "Perhaps small, perhaps meant merely to collapse the frame, but quite sufficient to kill whoever stands beneath it. Quickly now. Fetch Lestrade. We must stop this at once." I raced down the spiraling stairs, my breath echoing in the hollow shaft. Below, Lestrade and Reverend Penfold stood beside the pews, startled by the urgency in my descent. "Holmes says it's wired to explode," I shouted. The inspector's face went white. He barked orders at 2 constables to clear the nave, while the Reverend stumbled backward, crossing himself in horror. The bells above groaned once, twice, and then a terrible metallic shiver ran through the tower, as if the air itself had caught its breath. Holmes appeared an instant later, descending with the speed of a man pursued by death itself. "It's disarmed for now," he said curtly. "A simple break in the current was enough. Whoever designed this intended it to trigger remotely. The bells were the distraction. The true device was hidden beneath their sound." Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. "Good God, Holmes, what kind of madman does this?" "The deliberate kind," Holmes replied coldly. "A man who kills to silence, not to shock. This was meant to destroy the evidence, not the congregation." "We are very close, Lestrade, close enough that our enemy grows desperate." Reverend Penfold looked near collapse. "But why the church? Why the bells? Who could do such a thing?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "Because, Reverend, the bells lend sanctity to murder. What better cover than divine warning? Tell me, who would benefit from the deaths of Miss Vance, Pike, and Hall? You spoke of a bequest, a donation disputed among them." The Reverend's eyes flickered with hesitation. "Yes, a legacy of £50 left by Mrs. Agatha Parson. It was to be divided for maintenance of the church and the poor fund. But Miss Vance controlled the account, and Pike accused her of misappropriation. There were harsh words. Hall threatened to expose them both if they did not restore the sum. 3 people bound by greed," Holmes murmured. "And all 3 dead. Yet not 1 penny was withdrawn after Miss Vance's passing, which means someone else has already claimed it." Lestrade straightened. "You mean the Reverend himself?" Holmes's tone remained calm, but his eyes never left Penfold. "It is a possibility, though not yet proof. Still, fear not. Reverend, I accuse no man without evidence, but I must insist you produce the church's ledgers at once." The clergyman, pale and trembling, nodded and hurried to his study. As soon as he vanished through the vestry door, Holmes turned sharply to me. "Watson, we must search the tower base. The true control of the mechanism must lie somewhere near the ground. No one would risk rewinding it from above." We crossed the nave once more, Holmes crouching to inspect the flagstones near the western wall. After a moment, he tapped one stone with his cane, listening to the hollow response. "Ah, lift this slab, Watson." Together we pried it up, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. Inside was a wooden box lined with copper and fitted with a small galvanic battery, its wires leading upward into the wall. Holmes examined it quickly. A wireless relay of sorts, crude but effective. It sends current to the device above when the circuit is closed, which means someone nearby could control it. At that instant, a noise broke through the silence, the crunch of footsteps outside the vestry door. Holmes motioned me to extinguish the lantern. The faint outline of the Reverend appeared, but his hands were not empty. They clutched a small electrical key, its wire trailing into the shadows. "Stop where you are, Reverend," Holmes said sharply, his voice echoing with sudden authority. "Your parishioners may forgive sin, but Scotland Yard does not." Penfold froze, the color draining from his face. You don't understand. I never meant to kill them. I only wanted to frighten them, to bring confession, to make them repent." Holmes stepped closer, his expression cold as iron. Yet fear, once set in motion, rarely stops where you intend. You built your judgment into a machine, Reverend, and it condemned even those you did not mean to punish. Lestrade seized him roughly as he dropped the key, the wire snapping loose. The bells above trembled once more, their hollow tone echoing through the tower like a requiem for the dead. Holmes looked upward and murmured, almost to himself. And so, the bells rang not for heaven's call, but for man's guilt, mechanized and measured. Outside, the fog was lifting, but the faint chime still lingered in the air, as though London itself was listening. The bell's final echo faded into a dreadful stillness, and for a long moment no one spoke. Lestrade still held Reverend Penfold by the arm, while Holmes stood over the broken wire, studying the fallen key with a look of pained concentration. The Reverend, trembling and pale, stared at the floor as though it might open and swallow him. "It was meant to be divine punishment," he muttered at last, his voice barely audible. "A warning to those who sinned within these walls. But the machine," Cribbins said, "it would only frighten them, not harm them." Holmes's head turned sharply. "Cribbins, you say? So he was your accomplice, not your victim. I thought as much." He crouched beside the severed wire and ran a finger along its end, examining the frayed copper strands. "Yes. Cribbins built it to your specifications, did he not? But you lacked the mechanical knowledge to understand what he truly installed. You gave him coin and secrecy, and in return he gave you murder disguised as miracle." The Reverend's lips quivered. He swore it was harmless, that it would ring the bells as a sign of repentance. He said they would confess their wrongs before the sound ended. That was all I wanted, to make them see the hand of God. Holmes rose slowly, his expression now tinged with cold disdain. "You sought justice, Reverend. But you chose the tools of deceit. You forgot that machinery knows no conscience. When you tie a sermon to a gear, it will not stop to pray before it kills." Lestrade cleared his throat uneasily. "That may be, Holmes, but murder's murder. He's coming with me. I'll have Cribbins taken in as well." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Do so, but be cautious. Cribbins will not wait for the yard to knock twice. The man knows his device failed, and he will guess that Penfold has betrayed him. He will run, or worse, return to destroy what remains." The inspector nodded grimly and motioned for the constables to escort Penfold outside. As their footsteps receded into the fog, I turned to Holmes. "You believe Cribbins was the true architect, then?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Without question. Penfold may have imagined himself an avenging angel, but Cribbins forged the sword. There is too much precision in that mechanism, too deliberate, too cruel. Only an engineer versed in explosives could have built such a device. And note this, Watson, each death occurred one night after the other, at intervals too perfect for chance. Someone was watching, adjusting, testing the mechanism until it achieved its intended result. We stepped outside into the damp chill of the graveyard. The mist rolled across the headstones, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Lestrade's men were leading Penfold toward a waiting cab. Holmes stood for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the church tower rising darkly against the sky. "Do you hear that, Watson?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" I replied, listening. There was only the faint rustle of wind through the grass. "Exactly," Holmes said. "Silence. The bells are still, but their silence feels unnatural. Our adversary is not done. He will not allow his masterpiece to be found incomplete. When a craftsman's work fails, he does not weep, he corrects it." The words had scarcely left his mouth when a distant metallic clatter echoed from beyond the cemetery wall. Holmes's head snapped toward the sound. "Watson, come!" We crossed the churchyard swiftly, our lantern beams slicing through the fog. Near the iron gate stood a small outbuilding, a shed used to store tools and lamp oil. Its door hung open, and from within came the unmistakable rasp of metal on stone. Holmes moved like lightning, pushing the door wide. Inside, by the flicker of a single candle, crouched Cribbins himself, wrenching at a bundle of wires connected to a second device. He turned as we entered, his face twisted with fury. "You shouldn't have meddled, Holmes," he snarled. "It was perfect, sheer perfection. You've ruined it." Holmes advanced slowly, every word deliberate. "Perfection? You call murder perfection? You built your invention to obey, but it obeyed too well. 3 are dead, and the 4th nearly joined them." Cribbins backed away, his hand fumbling for a switch on the box beside him. "You'll never prove it. They'll think the bells took vengeance again, just like before." Holmes lunged. In the same instant, Cribbins struck the switch. A blinding spark erupted from the device, and the shed filled with acrid smoke. I seized Holmes by the shoulder, dragging him back into the open air as the candle guttered out and a dull explosion shook the ground. When the haze cleared, the shed was half collapsed, its contents reduced to splinters and soot. Cribbins lay motionless among the wreckage, his hand still clutching the melted key. Holmes bent beside the body, examining it with grim detachment. "A craftsman to the end," he murmured. "He died by the very perfection he worshipped." He rose, brushing the dust from his coat, his face drawn but resolute. "Come, Watson. The bells of Street Bartholomew's will ring no more, but before this night is done, we shall know why their silence began." As we walked back toward the dim outline of the church, the fog seemed to close behind us, swallowing the ruin and the dead man within it. Yet in the distance, from nowhere and everywhere at once, came the faint echo of a single bell, soft, hollow, and chilling as a final breath. The faint bell tone that drifted through the mist could not have been real, and yet it seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath our feet. Holmes halted, his head slightly bowed, eyes half closed, as if measuring the note's direction by instinct rather than sound. Then he spoke in that low, precise tone I had come to associate with the moment when deduction became revelation. "That, Watson, was no phantom echo. The vibration originated not from the tower, but from beneath us. The church hides more than one chamber." He strode back toward the vestry, his coat brushing the cold stone walls, and I followed closely. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of ozone left by Cribbins's infernal machine. Holmes snatched a lantern from a hook, knelt beside the altar, and began tapping the flagstones in a measured pattern. After several minutes, a hollow sound responded from a slab near the eastern wall. "Here," he said quietly. "This church has a crypt, but not one recorded in its registry, I'll wager. Help me, Watson." Together we pried the stone loose, revealing a narrow stair descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cold and dry, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. Holmes lit another match and led the way down, each step groaning beneath us as if reluctant to disturb whatever lay hidden there. The staircase ended in a small chamber lined with stone shelves, crypt niches long sealed and forgotten. But But at the far end, illuminated by our flickering light, stood something wholly out of place. A large brass cylinder fixed into the wall, attached by wires that vanished upward through the ceiling. Holmes approached it with reverent caution. "Remarkable," murmured. "Cribbins was cleverer than I supposed. This is no simple detonator, it's a resonance amplifier. The bells above were not merely rung by electric impulse, they were tuned to this device. Each toll would have carried vibration through the floor, shaking the air of this crypt until it sang like a living thing. I felt a chill run through me. Then those who heard the bells heard death, Watson," Holmes finished grimly. "Or rather, they believed they did. This amplifier was designed to create acoustic resonance, an invisible pressure capable of stunning or disorienting. In minds already gripped by superstition, that effect could easily provoke collapse or heart failure. Hall, Pike, Miss Vance, they were victims of suggestion amplified by sound itself." He crouched, tracing the wiring. "See how the copper extends into this small coil? Cribbins used alternating current to produce vibration at specific frequencies. Ingenious and monstrous. It explains why the Reverend's contrition became catastrophe. He thought he was invoking heaven, but he was merely awakening this devil in brass." For several moments Holmes stood silently, lost in thought. Then his expression shifted from analysis to something darker unease, perhaps even dread. "Watson, do you recall the final bell we heard after Cribbins perished?" "Yes," I said, glancing around the chamber uneasily. "It seemed to come from nowhere." He nodded slowly. "Exactly, which means the mechanism still functions, and something, or someone, has reactivated it." Before I could respond, a faint humming filled the air, deep and steady, like the growl of an invisible beast. The cylinder began to tremble. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the wires overhead quivered like the strings of a harp. Holmes's face hardened. "We're not alone down here." "Up! Watson, quickly!" We bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, emerging breathless into the vestry. The church, it was empty, or so it seemed. Then, from behind the pulpit, a figure rose, a man cloaked in shadow, his face hidden by the hood of a dark coat. In his hand gleamed a revolver. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. "Drop the weapon, Mr. Latham." The man stiffened, but did not lower the gun. "So you found it," he said bitterly. His voice carried a tone of educated precision, the accent of a man far above Cribbins's class. "You were bound to, I suppose. You always do." I recognized the name at once, Arthur Latham, the solicitor who had handled the disputed bequest. Holmes's eyes glinted. "Indeed, I wondered how long it would take you to appear. You were the executor of Mrs. Parsons' will, and therefore the only man with access to both the accounts and the church plans. When the others began to suspect, you enlisted Penfold and Cribbins to assist in your little performance of divine wrath. But when the mechanism claimed more than fear, you silenced your collaborators one by one." Latham laughed hollowly. "Penfold betrayed me to clear his conscience. Cribbins thought he could extort me. I gave them both what they earned." Holmes stepped forward slowly, his tone icy calm. "And now you intend to destroy the evidence beneath us." "I intend," said Latham, tightening his grip, "to finish what I began." He raised the revolver. Holmes's hand moved like lightning. He struck the lantern from the table, plunging the room into darkness. The shot cracked through the air, echoing against stone. I threw myself toward the sound and felt Holmes brush past me. There was a scuffle, a grunt, and the unmistakable thud of a weapon hitting the floor. When light returned, Holmes relit the lantern with calm efficiency. Latham lay sprawled at the base of the altar, his revolver kicked aside, his expression frozen in fury and disbelief. Holmes straightened his coat and regarded him coolly. "Your bells have tolled their last, Mr. Latham, and this time they rang for you." Outside, faint dawn light began to creep through the mist, pale and colorless. Holmes extinguished the lantern and gazed toward the eastern window. "Watson," he said softly, It appears the morning service has begun, and the dead, at last, may rest. The first grey light of dawn filtered through the high stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's, scattering pale shards of colour across the nave. The tension that had hung thick through the night began to ease, but only slightly. Latham lay bound on the floor beneath Lestrade's watch, his features drawn and colourless. Holmes stood over him, silent, one hand resting upon the back of a pew, his head bowed in thought. The faint hum from beneath the church, the resonance machine that had caused so much death, had finally ceased. But an uneasy vibration still seemed to linger in the air, as if the stones themselves remembered the horror that had passed. Lestrade broke the silence first. "Well, Holmes, that's the last of them, isn't it? Penfold, Cribbens, and now this gentleman solicitor, you've unmasked the lot." Holmes lifted his gaze slowly. "Not unmasked. Lestrade merely uncovered. A mask can be removed. A secret must be dismantled. We have done the latter, though not yet fully. You see, there remains one unanswered question. Who turned on the device after Cribbens's death?" Lestrade blinked. "You mean it wasn't Latham?" Holmes's thin lips curved into a faint, mirthless smile. "Latham was in hiding when it activated. He returned only when the resonance began again, to ensure his secret was destroyed. No, Inspector. Someone else struck that switch, and for a reason not entirely selfless." I stared at him in disbelief. "But who, Holmes? The Reverend was in custody, Cribbens dead, and Latham absent. Who could possibly have remained?" Holmes turned toward the church entrance. Through the misted doorway, a familiar figure approached Mrs. Hall, the sexton's widow. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with something between grief and fierce determination. She stepped hesitantly inside, clutching a small wooden box to her chest. "I heard the bells stop," she said softly. "Is it over?" Lestrade stiffened. "You shouldn't be here, ma'am." "This is a crime scene." Holmes raised a hand. "Let her speak." He regarded her keenly. "Mrs. Hall, I must ask, did you return to this church during the night, after we last spoke?" The woman hesitated, then nodded faintly. I came back after you left with the Reverend. I wanted to see the bells once more. They were his life's work, you see. When I found the wire broken, I thought, perhaps it was wrong that they should be silent forever. I only meant to make them ring once, just once more for him." Holmes exhaled quietly, not in anger but in understanding. "And in doing so, you reactivated the very machine that had been built to kill." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what it would do." He stepped forward and took the small box from her trembling hands, opening it carefully. Inside lay a delicate brass medallion, engraved with a cross and a cluster of small, intricate gears, the inner workings of Cribbens's design. Holmes studied it, then said softly, "Your husband's keepsake. He must have salvaged it from the device before his death. It is proof that he knew the danger and tried, perhaps, to stop it." Mrs. Hall sank onto a pew, her sobs echoing faintly through the vast, hollow church. Holmes turned away, the medallion still in his hand. "Watson, you see how fear corrupts reason. The Reverend sought redemption through terror. Cribbens sought mastery through invention, Latham sought profit through deceit, and all were destroyed by the same force they thought they controlled. Even Mrs. Hall's grief became an instrument of danger." Lestrade's, a voice softened. "What will become of her?" "That is for the courts to decide," Holmes said, his tone distant. "But I should hope mercy tempers judgment. She did not build this tragedy, she merely reopened its wound." Holmes knelt beside the fallen solicitor, examining him as the man stirred groggily. "Latham," he said evenly, "you will find it easier to confess now than later. The Yard will discover that Mrs. Parsons' legacy passed briefly through your accounts, before disappearing into the void of a charitable trust, a trust that you yourself controlled. You killed 3 people to conceal that theft. Confession may yet earn you something less than infamy. And what of you, Holmes? You meddle in the lives of others, destroying them for your satisfaction. Do you call that justice? Holmes's gaze hardened, but his reply came calm and cutting. I call it balance, Mr. Latham. The world does not need men like you to define morality. It requires men willing to reveal it. As Lestrade's men carried Latham away, dawn broke in earnest. The first true rays of sunlight struck the stained glass, bathing the pews in muted hues of crimson and gold. Holmes stood in that light, weary yet unyielding, his profile etched in the fragile glow. "Watson," he said quietly, "have you ever considered that sound is the most deceitful of senses? A bell may summon to prayer or to death. It may call the living or mock the dead, but it is never innocent." We walked together down the church steps, the fog thinning around us. Behind, the bells hung silent, gleaming faintly in the morning light. I glanced back once, half expecting them to stir again. But they remained still, their silence now complete and eternal. Holmes paused at the gate, his coat brushing the damp iron rail. "The case of the bells that rang for the dead, Watson," he murmured, "has ended in a quiet fitting to its music. Yet somewhere in that stillness, one hears a warning that the hand which seeks to imitate judgment soon becomes the judged." And with that, he turned away, his figure merging with the grey London mist, while behind us the church of St. Bartholomew's seemed at last to rest its bells, its dead, and its secrets all finally laid to peace. The hansom cab rattled along the cobbled road toward Baker Street, its wheels splashing through the remnants of the early morning rain. I sat opposite Holmes, who leaned back against the seat, his eyes half closed yet far from rest. His long fingers drummed absently against his knee, a sign I had come to recognize as the rhythm of thought. Though the case had concluded, I knew his mind was still unraveling its final threads. "You are unusually silent, Holmes," I ventured after some minutes. "Surely even you must feel satisfaction at having solved such a curious and terrible affair." He opened his eyes, the faintest trace of a smile playing across his features. "Satisfaction, Watson, is a word better suited to appetite than intellect. I feel relief no more. And yet," he paused, glancing out at the drifting fog that rolled past the cab window, "there is a discordant note that still troubles me. Latham's guilt is clear, Penfold's delusion explained, and Cribbens's invention destroyed." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, and yet the bells themselves remain an enigma of sorts. They were instruments of deception, certainly, but they also held a truth of their own. Tell me, Watson, do you recall the first words the Reverend spoke when he came to us?" I thought back. "The bells rang by themselves each time before a death." "Precisely," Holmes said softly. "Before a death, not after. The tolling was not coincidence, it was orchestration. But what I had not accounted for was that the mechanism, when first constructed, could not have been controlled remotely. Cribbens lacked the means for such refinement. Therefore, someone else must have later modified his device to operate from a distance." I frowned. "But who else could have done so?" "Latham, surely." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Latham had motive, yes, but not the skill. He was a thief, not an engineer. He could have paid Cribbens to alter it, but Cribbens died before the final modification. Yet the final version functioned perfectly, with precision that surpassed the mason's earlier work. So I asked myself who completed it. The cab jolted as it turned onto Baker Street. Holmes did not wait for an answer. "Mrs. Hall," he murmured. Not consciously, of course, but her husband, the late sexton, left his notes behind. In her grief, she may have tampered with the mechanism unknowingly, following his sketches, trying to restore the bells as they were. A tragic circle, Watson. Each soul touched the design in turn, and each suffered for it. We arrived at Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual anxious fussing over the soot on our coats. Holmes brushed past her politely, heading straight for his chair. The fire burned low, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the comforting familiarity of our sitting room. It was as though the city itself had been shut out, leaving only us and the faint ticking of the clock. Holmes poured 2 cups of tea, handing me one without looking. The moral architecture of this case, Watson, is what fascinates me most. Each participant played a note in the same dreadful symphony: greed, guilt, fear, remorse, and the bells were the orchestra. A more perfect metaphor for human folly I cannot imagine. He drew his violin from its stand and plucked one string thoughtfully. You see, my dear friend, sound can move men to prayer or panic, depending upon the design behind it. That Cribbens's mechanism achieved murder through vibration alone is less alarming than the fact that its victims died believing they heard fate calling their names. The human mind, when primed by superstition, will obey even the faintest whisper of doom. I could not help but shudder. Then you truly believe they died from fear? Fear is a powerful executioner, Holmes replied. A man's pulse can betray him faster than poison if his mind accepts death as inevitable. The Reverend's victims were condemned long before the bells began to ring. They merely awaited their sentence. He set down the violin and leaned back, exhaling a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. And yet, consider how swiftly belief can twist truth. To Penfold, the sound was divine judgment. To Latham, it was prophet cloaked in piety. To Cribbens, it was proof of genius. But in reality, the only divine voice was that of machinery, the only god ambition. For a while, neither of us spoke. Outside, the city was stirring awake. The distant rumble of carts, the shrill cry of a newspaper boy, the muffled bells of street poles far away. Holmes stared into the fire, and for an instant the flickering light gave his features a strangely haggard cast. "I wonder," I said at last, "do you ever tire of such darkness, Holmes? Of looking into the hearts of men and finding only shadow?" He smiled faintly, his voice soft but steady. "On the contrary, Watson, it is within shadow that one finds shape. Were the world only light, we should see nothing at all." He turned then, his gaze distant yet peaceful. "And so, my friend, another case is concluded. The bells have fallen silent, but their echo will linger here, in the recesses of memory, where all mysteries ring long after their resolution." The clock struck 8. Holmes rose, straightened his dressing gown, and crossed to the window. "I fancy the morning paper will have much to say about the bells that rang for the dead. No doubt they will call it a miracle unmasked. But Watson." He glanced back. His eyes glinting with wry amusement. "I call it simply another lesson in acoustics and in the perilous harmony between guilt and sound." And with that, he turned his gaze once more to the fog outside, where London awakened beneath the weight of its own secrets, and where, faintly, distantly, the bells of another church began to ring. The fire burned low that evening in Baker Street, throwing long, wavering shadows upon the walls. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, and in its dim glow, the silhouette of Sherlock Holmes appeared almost spectral, thin, upright, and lost in thought. He stood before the hearth, the flicker of flame reflected in his sharp grey eyes, his violin resting upon the table beside an untasted cup of tea. I had grown accustomed to silence after a case's conclusion, yet tonight it carried a peculiar weight, as though some unseen current of thought held him still. Finally, he spoke, his tone soft but measured. "Watson, there is something profoundly unsettling about the notion of sound as an accomplice to murder. A bullet or blade one may comprehend, but a vibration, a mere oscillation of air, to end a life? It strikes at the very fabric of reason." I nodded, watching him closely. "And yet, Holmes, you have often said that reason itself is the first casualty of superstition. These victims died believing the bells foretold their deaths. Their minds gave form to their fears before any machine could act upon them." He smiled faintly. "Just so. Cribbins may have built the mechanism, but belief wounded the spring. Consider it, Watson. Every victim heard what they most dreaded, and their hearts obeyed the prophecy. It is a fascinating, if grim, testament to the frailty of human conviction. He turned toward the mantelpiece, where the small bronze bell from Highgate now stood, its surface glinting softly in the firelight. Holmes reached out and struck it lightly with a pencil. The note that followed was pure, haunting, and lingered in the room long after the sound itself had ceased. "Curious," he murmured, half to himself. "The same tone that sent men to their graves can sound so harmless in this room. Fear, Watson, transforms the familiar into the fatal. That, perhaps, is the truest danger mankind faces." I leaned back in my chair, reflecting upon the long night at Street. Bartholomew's the trembling bells, the echoing crypt, the tortured confession of the Reverend, and the despairing eyes of Mrs. Hall. "It was a tragedy from start to finish," I said quietly. "Each sought to control what could not be controlled. Guilt, grief, greed, and each was undone by their own design." Holmes nodded, his gaze still fixed on the bell. "A perfect trinity of motive avarice, remorse, and obsession. Yet there is one figure I cannot condemn entirely." "Mrs. Hall?" "Precisely. Her crime was born of love, not malice. She wished only to hear again the sound that reminded her of her husband. In doing so, she rekindled the very engine of death. That is not wickedness, Watson, it is tragedy." He moved toward the window then, parting the curtain just enough to peer out into the mist. The faint clang of distant carriage wheels echoed from below, mingling with the softer toll of church bells across the city. "You hear that, Watson? London never sleeps. Its bells never cease. Somewhere, at this very moment, another man schemes, another suffers, and another listens for a sound that may seal his fate. It is the eternal music of the human condition." He turned back toward me, a glimmer of melancholy softening his features. "I sometimes wonder, my friend, whether those who live by logic are any less bound by superstition than those who perish by it. We trust in patterns, in deduction, in the evidence of our senses, yet how easily they deceive us when emotion enters the equation." "You speak almost like a philosopher tonight, Holmes," I said with a smile. He gave a short laugh. "Heaven forbid. Philosophy dulls the edge of perception. Still, one must occasionally acknowledge that there are mysteries. Even my methods cannot pierce those that dwell within the human heart." For a while, we sat in companionable silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Then Holmes reached for his violin, drawing the bow gently across the strings. A soft melody filled the room, low, contemplative, and strangely mournful. It reminded me of the bells, yet stripped of their menace, transformed into something pure and distant. The music drifted through the fog, as if carrying away the remnants of that dreadful night. When he finally lowered the instrument, he spoke once more, his voice calm, almost tender. "You will write this case in your chronicles, I trust, Watson. But omit the more ghastly details. Let it be a study not of crime, but of consequence. Call it what you will, but remember that it began and ended with sound." "I have already chosen a title," I replied quietly. "The Case of the Bells, that rang for the dead." Holmes inclined his head approvingly. "An apt choice, and if the world learns anything from it, let it be this, that every note of fear struck by human hands will, in time, demand its echo." The fire had burned to embers when I finally rose to leave him. Holmes stood once more at the window, his silhouette framed against the pale glow of the street lamps beyond. The faintest trace of that eerie bell tone seemed to hum in the distance, but perhaps it was only my imagination or the lingering resonance of all we had witnessed. As I closed my notebook, Holmes spoke one last time, so softly that his words nearly vanished into the hush of the room. "Rest easy, Watson. The bells have ceased their song, but listen closely enough, and you will always hear them. And as I looked upon him still, austere, and half lost in the London fog, I knew that, for Sherlock Holmes, the music of mystery would never end.